This is a team that everyone can use. The numbers I'm going to show you are numbers against a boss with core, so please bear that in mind. We'll start anchoring some damage for expectation, but please note that there are some estimations, extrapolations involved in the numbers, as well as trying to keep in mind that evening out the stats for every other units around. Some inaccuracies may appear depending on the account and unit investment, as each account are going to vary from each other. There are going to be differences on how a unit performs, and especially with different devices and players. But these numbers are made to be as even as possible across different units. Use these numbers as a frame of reference and you can decide to do it on your own if you want to. Using the most basic theme of Litter and Rosanna, we can evaluate these units around. For comparing the units for personal damage, I have input two other basic DPS like Guillotine and Scarlet that resembles other units as Assault Rifle and Machine Gun. In a nutshell, using Litter and Rosanna as a base buffer, given that Modernia is hitting 100% of damage on her own and that 100% is 1 bill, the following damage are as follows in terms of personal damage. Asuka did about 920 mil damage, which is 90% damage or so. Ray did about 840 mil damage, which is about 80-84% damage. Guillotine did about 90-92% damage as well with her bursting, and Scarlet did about 55-60% damage in comparison to Modernia. We're getting 60% is Scarlet bursting and about 55% is when she wasn't bursting. Now we're not here to talk about Guillotine and Scarlet, but this does give you a perspective of some of the old units comparison. If we had to look at it at an individual damage level, we had the following: Litter, Rosanna at 110M, 105M, Modernia at 1 bill, assuming that there is no Ray nor Asuka buff, Asuka at 920 mil with no Modernia nor Ray buff, and Ray at 840 mil with no mod and Asuka buff. They did a total of about 2.975 bill damage, about almost 3 bill, and this is just with individual damage with only Litter and Rosanna as buffer. Now let's take a look as when we are starting to forming synergies in teams together. Putting Asuka and Ray and Modernia together, actually synergizing their buffs along and damage increase significantly. Litter and Rosanna are the same, but for Modernia, she increases her damage from 1 bill to 1.5 bill, and Asuka reaches from 920 mil to 1.1 bill, and Ray is about 840 mil to 925 mil. So Modernia got about a 50% damage increase, Asuka got about 20% damage increase, and Ray got about 10% damage increase. A total of 3.7 bill roughly plus or minus, and it does give about a total of team-wide 25% total damage increase across the board. So as you can see, this team synergy is really good when combined together. Getting just one of them is a disservice to the other units. As a side note, I would like to point out though that if you are playing at 30 FPS, the damage does go down significantly, considering 2 of the 3 DPS here are both machine guns. For example, Litter got about a damage reduction of 27% damage, Rosanna lost 14%, Modernia lost almost half, 50% nearly of her damage, Ray almost lost half as well, as they're both machine guns, and Asuka lost almost 20% of her damage. As you notice here as well, Asuka is the least affected unit compared to the other 2 DPS. So playing actually on crappier devices will make Asuka shine on top compared to Modernia and Ray. This makes sense as their damage is really tied to their fire rate. The fire rate between 60 FPS and 30 FPS is huge depending on the weapon type. With sniper rifle and rocket launcher on auto, they only increased about 4.63%, and shotgun going from 30 FPS to 60 FPS was 7%. Assault rifle is going from 10 bullets per second into 12 bullets per second at 60 FPS, and you can see that submachine gun is from 15 to 20 and machine gun is 30 to 60. Machine guns get affected the most with the worst devices, while sniper rifle and rocket launcher and shotguns get affected the least. As you can see, also assault rifles and submachine guns still get affected as well. Regarding Asuka versus Ray, who's the better buffer? Well, let's compare it with these two set up in the fire advantage situation. Crown the Alice, Asuka, Modernia, Crown the Alice, Ray, and Modernia. In these two setups, Alice did 5% more damage with Asuka in the team than if Ray was there. Meanwhile, Modernia did 3% more damage with Ray in the team than if Asuka was there. There may be some comments about synergy and everything, but don't exactly look at the exact percentage of numbers, but instead understand the main take take away from this. Please note that the values again might be different with different teams and setups. Majority of Alice's damage come from her burst. Meanwhile, Moderna's damage is more damage over time. Assuming the boss has core where Asuka is also effective, we can compare them depending on which is the better receiver of the buff. In a raw buff performance, Ray would have the better buff overall, assuming the other unit doesn't have attack damage delusion as well. The difference with Asuka comes from the fact that Asuka's buff triggers regardless of who bursts. Meanwhile, Ray does have an attack buff, but she also has the damage buff when Ray is bursting. This means that units where majority of their damage come from their burst, such as Alice in this situation, enjoys more from Asuka than with Ray. Naturally, if the boss doesn't have core, then Ray is the better option. So if we're talking about general buff coverage in terms of just damage increase, Ray slightly comes out on top with also her versatility. But again, I'd like to point out that there are just some variations depending on the unit's skill set as well. Now, what about a couple of other teams in comparison? What if we add Ludmilla and replace either Asuka or Ray in the team? What about the more recent Electro team that's surging up now? Using Ludmilla, this is her damage difference in comparison with standard Asuka, Ray, and Moderna. Replacing Ray with Ludmilla, Litter gets about 9% damage increase, Rosanna gets about 9% damage increase, but Moderna loses about 13% damage and Asuka loses 9% damage. And switching Ray to Ludmilla increases the damage to about 13%. Overall though, it did lose damage because we lost a lot of damage for Moderna when losing Ray. Placing Asuka with Ludmilla, Litter is about the same as before and same with Rosanna, where it's both 9% damage increase thanks to Ludmilla. Meanwhile, Moderna did get about a little bit of 3% damage increase. And switching from Asuka to Ludmilla lost us a little bit of damage. And then using Ray, where she's getting Ludmilla's buff instead of Asuka, Ray lost a little bit of damage, which is like 1%. But roughly plus or minus, the damage came out roughly the same. So a top tier half DPS, half debuffer like Ludmilla doesn't have much synergy to the team, as both Asuka and Ray are both synergizing with one another. If we're talking about buffer for Moderna, Ray ends up being slightly better buffer for Moderna. So pairing them all three with one another is actually really good. So how does it fare against the more recent popular Electro team in neutral? The current upcoming Electro team right now is Exia Treasure with Dala, Ain, Summer Anise, and the last being a more consistent Biscuit, or if it's possible to do no healer, then it could be either Scarlet or Guillotine. In the team with Biscuit, the overall team damage on neutral did about 2.3 bill. Meanwhile, in the no healer team with Scarlet, it did about 2.6 bill, and with Guillotine, it did about 2.8 bill. It was very risky to use Guillotine or Scarlet, but also on top of that, it's also just not doing as high of a damage. Although primarily, it's because of Summer Anise doesn't really perform well on shooting range, and also Summer Anise has majority of her damage coming from the elemental damage bonus with her bursting. Looking at this, the fire team is starting to seem promising, right? Well, let's evaluate it a little bit more as well. That team we've been comparing has been using a valuable buffer like Litter. Assuming that Litter has to go to other team for that particular element advantage, what's going to happen on the other neutral scenarios? Well, we could form these following teams with Volume with Novel on against Iron and Wind, and Volume and Mass on Electric, and Dorothy and Rosanna on Water. I didn't use Rosanna on Wind because there's a high chance that we'll be putting Rosanna with Summer Sakura again next time. As you can see here, removing Litter and trying to readjust for the different variation of the solo raid scenario of needing like a particular element, the damage did go quite a bit down. But nonetheless, there's still a good synergy with them with one another. They do a solid DPS on their own, and they do add up and buff with one another. So even if the burst 1 and burst 2 doesn't really buff as much, they still do a fairly significant amount of damage. Okay, now that we've made some numbers, what's next? Let's talk about the teams. Moderna has slowly lost her spot in the bunnies for two particular reasons. One, it's requiring Noir to burst herself, and that is a downside because ideally you do want a good DPS to be bursting on the burst 3 category. You don't want to burst with Moderna because it does lose an overall DPS of the team. Two, the shotgun bunnies has been becoming more and more popular with Dove, Blanc, Bunny Soda, and Noir. And then the last one being F-Flex elemental units such as like Drake for fire, Maid Privity for electric, Guilty for wind, or Sugar for iron. As mentioned, these three fire DPS combo are a great combination together. In particular, they can be used as flex for different elements by simple readjusting their burst 1 or burst 2 units that are supporting them. To give an example, if we're looking at an iron advantage solo raid, we can look into this kind of combination of Litter, Rosanna, Asuka, Ray, and Modernia. Or if we're using Litter elsewhere, then we can opt in into using like Volume and Novel, and then the trio, and technically you can use Marciana or regular Rupee as well, but they're not as effective as Novel. Meanwhile, Summer Helm is really valuable unit that will likely get used by the other top tier DPS teams for iron. So this fire team combination will likely not use that unless there's other feature units that are better for top tier DPS teams. Litter or Volume and Quincy or Mast is another combination for the electric advantage. Electric doesn't give much flexibility options, so we'll likely have to use them as burst 2. In the situation of wind advantage solo raid, likely the position of Litter and Summer Rosanna will go to Summer Sakura, so we'll likely have to relegate this team into using Volume or Novel. Volume plus Novel or Mast, where Volume is the unit to do the wind typing. Alternatively, we could end up removing Asuka and then using Litter, Summer Rosanna, Summer Sakura, Ray, and Modernia, but usually, you would rather want to buff also Summer Sakura, so there is a better possibility of just using Maxwell or Ludmilla instead alongside with those. There's also the chance of using Asuka and then replacing Ray if we need Asuka's tanking capabilities that Ray's shield couldn't do enough. And finally, the situation of Water Solo Raid, there's two primary options we could opt into. One is either using Litter or Volume, and then with Rem, with the trio is an option to use. Although Rem doesn't do much to the team other than personal damage and some heals, she'll fill in the elemental requirement for burst 2 category. Another option is using Dorothy as burst 1 for the water requirement and then using Summer Rosanna for burst 2. Naturally, you just replace Summer Rosanna with other substitute that you have left like Novel or whatever you can fill. The good thing about this one is you don't necessarily need Dorothy with Privity in this situation because the team itself doesn't burst as fast of energy regen, so Dorothy's cooldown would be just roughly enough when running with Asuka, Ray, and Modernia. Depending if the boss has core or not, or if we need a tanker or not, we could end up opting Asuka out or Ray out. There's also an option that likely will have some more units in the future in burst 3 for that particular element. In that case, we're going to replace one of them for that burst 3 DPS as well. In particular, still, Modernia will be the mainstay between the three, and either Asuka or Ray could be replaced depending on the boss mechanics and whatnot. We can't really predict the future. And as mentioned already before, the crappier devices, then Asuka will likely outperform the machine guns. But that's something on a user-to-user basis. So to sum it all up, get both Asuka and Ray as it will form a good synergy with Modernia. We can build different elemental teams with them with a slight tweak of either burst 1 or burst 2 category. With crappier devices or 30 FPS, Asuka can outperform Ray and Modernia in terms of DPS. Although God, seriously, shift up, just fix the fire rate tied to FPS issues, seriously. Come on. Assuming with core, Asuka is a better buffer for on-burst fire units such as Alice. These units are the units where we want to burst themselves and majority of their damage come from their bursts. Otherwise, if there's no core or if it's an off-burst unit like Modernia, then Ray would come out on top in terms of buffing capabilities. In terms of defensive capabilities, they both have the ability to defend the team. But depending on the boss mechanics, either one could be effective or not. But they're good options nonetheless that would allow us to have the possibility to build a more offensive team setup with this fire trio team. Regarding the duplicates, I will leave the option to you. The biggest convincing I could do for you is these are collab characters and there's a good chance that they will never come back. Overall, these units are excellent picks. That is for now. Assuming we don't get power grab, right? Shift up, right?